Well, I suppose we'll get started. Everyone, welcome to Digital Trends. My name is Mike Griffith. I've been putting this lecture series together for the past year or so now, amazingly enough. This will be our last Digital Trends session of the fall semester. We already have two scheduled in the spring, and I'll send around a flyer for each of you to take with you, detailing what we'll be doing. Then in January, Daniel Sharp from the music department will be presenting on a project that he's been doing with his students where they're taking individual tracks of music and then recording an analysis of those tracks and using Sony Vegas to cut them together into podcasts of analysis. So that's a really great project. It's falling under the Digital Communications project. Then our February lecture will also be in terms of Tulane Digital Communications, which will be Todd Kennedy from the English and Composition department. He's been running a project in his 101 classes this semester, the first part of which was just to do an image analysis using Final Cut Express. So the students could take what they would normally do for image analysis and actually use Final Cut to zoom in, to record dialogue, and to actually narrate their image analysis. And then their class is turning that into a larger documentary project at the end of the semester. In fact, they're building their documentaries right now. So in February, we'll get a display of what those projects look like along with a discussion of implementing these technologies in the classroom. Today, we have Felicia McCarren. She's going to be talking about her research in the French Sahara. So by all means, I'll turn it over to her.
Thanks. Okay, a couple quick thank yous before I start, because there are people in the room here without whom I would not be standing in front of you. Clay McGovern, first of all, many thanks for your patience. Olivier Bourdurionnet, our colleague at UNO. I'm looking for some other colleagues, not here, but if they walk in, I will mention them later. And a special thanks to my husband, Ali Laishi, who never gets to hear me give a talk because he's usually doing the childcare. And in particular, I'm grateful to him because he's made it possible for me to start this work in the Sahara in the south of Morocco. He's been my guide and my interpreter. He's made it possible for me to film people and to interview them there. And he's now giving back to his community by launching a project in community economic development for conscientious environmental and cultural tourism trekking in the Sahara. You can find him at www.landsahara.com. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see my students here, be able to talk to you in another venue. The work that I'm going to present today has just recently been published in the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, which you can get in the library here. And it draws on three bodies of work. The first is the field work in Morocco. The second is work that I've been doing on French cinematic representations of colonial and post-colonial North Africa and North Africans in Arabophone North Africans in the metropole. And the third body of work that I'm drawing on is an exploration of technology's power and problems from the history and theory of technology. I'm going to skip very quickly across these domains, so please bear with me. And if there's anything you'd like me to come back to in the question session, I'd be happy to look again at clips or images or slides. Does everyone know what Téléphone Arabe is? In French, it's a colloquial term, okay? And I'm going to speak about it in some ways as a literal term today. I think it can tell us a lot about technology. A friend from Algiers tells me that Téléphone Arabe is a game played by Algerian children. One gives a message to the next, who passes it on down the line, and the last player in the group then delivers out loud the final funny version of the message. A French linguist, a generation older, tells me that this same game in France was called the ambassador's game, le jeu de l'ambassadeur. Well, I am unable to explain how this game, mocking the kind of miscommunication that both defines and derails diplomacy, took on the name Téléphone Arabe. This paper today is going to follow the development of the term from international intercultural communication to children's game from the poetics of code scrambling to the politics of privacy, and from diplomacy to terrorism. Metropolitan technologies such as the telephone represent colonial domination, from the cultural and linguistic legacies of technology transfer to the metaphors and images through which phone service is sold in the post-independence market. After the colonial pattern of one-way technology transfer, the more recent global circulation of telephoning practices suggests to me not equal access to the same level of technology for all, but rather the continuation of a time lag in the former colonies. In spite of the synchronicity and instantaneity of techno theory, there remain significant differences in techno practices. As a mode of reappropriation, Téléphone Arabe resonates now in Western ears with the fear of communications technologies such as the cell phone being used not for nationalist but for internationalist terrorist ends, linked to Islamic, if not Arabic, extremism. Concomitant with this has been a growing international effort at telephone surveillance that emphasizes the bringing to light of terrorist networks. The screening of Gillo Pontecorvo's 1966 film, The Battle of Algiers, which you see here, at the Pentagon after the September 11th attacks, suggests an attempt to visualize and study as exemplary for terrorists the FLN's Téléphone Arabe organization in the Algiers Kasbah during the Algerian War. While focusing on questions related to oral communication, communication practices, and theories, this paper today also considers their filmic representation in order to explore what Frederick Jameson calls the problem of representation posed by technological forms that are invisible or create invisibility. I explore how the orality and invisibility of telephone technology has been linked to Islam and to the iconoclasm of Islamic extremism, and has been used to justify telephone surveillance. The combined fear and fantasy of an Arab, and I'm putting it in quotes, use of the telephone, a literalization of the metaphor of Téléphone Arabe, reinforces cultural, ethnic, and religious differences in spite of a rhetoric of globalization, technological progress, and circulation of goods and practices. Such a formulation ignores the ways in which all users of the technology are subject to the same prosthetic dependence on it, to the same constraints of use, and to the same interpolation. Okay. As a French term, Téléphone Arabe draws on the history of European fear and conquest of what Said called in Orientalism the, quote, sheer, unadorned, and persistent fact of being an Arab, the indecipherable, inaccessible, and threatening otherness of the Arab colonial other. The children's game, Téléphone Arabe, refers to the social network that predates, absorbs, and even transcends the networks created by telephone technology. Applied to the network of gossip and other forms of information exchange, the term serves as both a critical stereotype and a signifier of fear of the colonized. In the Battle of Algiers, for example, the FLN's Téléphone Arabe is a cellular organization that makes information passing impermeable to the French army, except via torture. In the film, the FLN resistance transmits its messages in writing, while sometimes accompanied by a puzzle or code word. The message passes from one FLN leader to another along a chain, in which each transmitter is known and trusted. This tightly knit communication network can only be broken by torture, against which the FLN asks its operatives to resist for 24 hours, to render any information extracted useless to the French. This silence, revealing the bond of the communication network, holds the organization together and gives it life after its early defeats. Yet from the French perspective, which is also represented in the Battle of Algiers, Téléphone Arabe signifies the technological naivete of the colonized from the army's point of view. And here, in the film, it's expressed primarily through the French general, the colonel, commander, Mathieu. Opposing and suppressing the colonizer deploys the technologies that have made his nation great, the sophisticated walkie-talkie and telephone technology of the army that invades and then controls the space of the Kasbah, and whose journalists diminish the space between Algiers and Paris with instantaneous reporting via telephone, the telephonic instantaneity based on transoceanic cables, the system that reigned until very recently. In the film, the French commander Mathieu openly calls on the support of the French press and says that military victory depends on them, significantly linking military intelligence and strategic command and journalistic propaganda, whose reliance on telephone type technologies are all represented on screen in the film. And let's take a look at a series of very brief clips from the Battle of Algiers. Oops, stop. VCR, 10 seconds.
What if I tell you?
Aucun incident sérieux. Il y a calme absolu dans le quartier où nous sommes. Je te rappelle ça. Mathieu, viens de café.
يا راح سيدي تولي باتو
ايه هنيجي باتو
احبس هاي
So the point here is this low technology actually ends up winning this part of the story, okay? One generation is destroyed, but we know that it's not over. And against the very impressive French technology, it's impressive to see what this network can do. One of the great ironies of independence, and now I'm moving on to another section, is that the former colony turns inevitably to the metropolitan motherland to buy its technology. In the portrait of the colonized, Albert Memmi describes the moment when people in the colonies or former colonies revolt against the consumption of the technology of the former colonizer, like anything but, right? We'll take anything but the former colonizer's products, preferring the products of other countries with a vengeance. The colonial legacy of technological dependency is perhaps less ambiguous in places like Morocco, and here I'm just comparing with Algeria, which has adopted French technologies such as telephone and cellular telephone service after 4 decades of protectorate status rather than 130 years of departmental status, colonization. In Mother Comes of Age, the Moroccan writer Driss Chaibi recounts the hilarious technological trials of his mother, whose cloistered upbringing in Casablanca changes radically in the 1930s and 1940s, with first a radio and then a telephone in her home. In this charming portrait, the teenage bride turned young mother who during the protectorate mobilizes the family's wealth and her own energy in a technological conversion. We see her embodying a whole nation, basically, in her personal experience. Like Flaubert's Felicity, the techno-peasant who is unable to map the world, Chaibi's mother understands her world in essentially medieval topographies that first expand rather than disappear with her education. The telephone, for example, allows her to visit her sister in Fez. She speaks to every operator as if they know her personally, and she navigates the city by phone via an oral network in a way that she could not on foot. While the telephone is about passing messages, building on the pre-existing network, like the walkie-talkie, it also gives purchase over space, controlling the space of the Kasbah or the city. This crazy understanding and use of technology in which the mother confuses the telephone's voice communication with presence rather than absence, and with freedom of movement in space rather than sequestration, approaches the cultural climate of the invention of the telephone theorized by Avital Ronell in the Telephone book. Ultimately, it allows the mother to build a network beyond her household that takes on a political dimension linked to the independence movement. In Shaibi's narrative, the mother manages both to adapt to the colonizer's technology and to bend the technology to serve her purposes. With tremendous admiration mixed with comedy, Shaibi paints his mother's successful Téléphone Arabe as a third world response to technology transfer, which in the end turns the colonizer's own instrument against him, even while identifying with him. As Shaibi's memoir reminds us, the telephone, like all technologies, also has a colonial history, concurrent with its development in the metropole. Just as nations are forged and produced through technologies such as the military and the media, nations also give their names to certain technologies, in effect branding them. In the former colonies, the colonial technological legacy remains built into the environment long after independence, and even when it no longer works. Thus, colonial communications technologies across the generations and through immigration across continents and cultures can also found miscommunication. Recuperated by Arabic speakers, multilingual residents of former French colonies, immigrants, or their monolingual transnational descendants in the metropole, Téléphone Arabe becomes a joke, mocking the formidable social bond that resisted colonial domination. In these contexts, Téléphone Arabe designates the failed communication networks, the untrustworthiness of old world structures that simply no longer work under assimilation or even integration in France. In reference to the homeland, Téléphone Arabe would no longer represent the pride of the homegrown resistance, but the failure of independence technology, something like the joke about the Algerian national airline, Air Algérie. Many of you probably have heard this joke. It's referred to by a broad sector of its customers as Air Inshallah. Literally, that would mean the airline of God's will, but in the joke, it comes out to mean something more like flying on a wing in a prayer. The person who actually believes that social networks are stronger than technologies comes out looking provincial. And I'm going to shift now to a 2004 film, a French co-production called The Long Trip. Ismail Ferrouki's film. In the film, we see the contrast between the old technology and the new as a generational conflict. A French high school student drives his Moroccan immigrant father from France to Mecca. The young Frenchman is trying to pass his baccalaureate and to work out things with his girlfriend. And in the first few days on the road, we see that his life is organized entirely around his cell phone. A clear parallel is established between the religious horizon of his father's life and the satellite that controls his son's. As the father picks up his rug and goes to pray, the son digs out his phone. And in this image, and in the clip I'll show you in a minute, we hear the voiceover is the son's conversation with the girlfriend that's layered onto the scene of the father praying. So these are very closely doubled in the film. The father who wants his son to understand something of the world of his faith jettisons the phone into a garbage can while en route. The father's belief connects him to the Muslims from all over the world who gather in Mecca, and even provides him the means to communicate with the many people who do not speak his language along the way. But from the son's perspective, his father's network looks something like Air Inshallah until the end. Let's see if I can call this up.
Non, papa. On est dans une douane.
المرقف
Tu vois bien que c'est pas un endroit pour prier.
وش كنت أمر بالله؟
Grazie, guarda.
Ça va? Non, j'ai des petits problèmes de famille. Mais rien de grave. Relève d'ici, je dois m'absenter quelque temps. Je t'expliquerai. Mais là, je peux pas te parler, je dois raccrocher.
This critique of the Téléphone Arabe suggests a failed communication not only across the generations, right, that's signed here in the language they speak. The father always speaks Arabic, the son always speaks French, but it also signals this failed communication geopolitically between North Africans in France and in the Maghreb. Casting it as a joke, in a couple of scenes I'm going to mention now but won't be able to show you, reflects a self-critique on the part of former colonial subjects or their descendants that reproduces the oppressive superiority of the colonizer that in Europe has taken shape as racism against immigrants. In the former colonies, the self-critique credits the First World with cutting-edge technology and mocks the legacy of exploitation by and resistance to metropolitan technology, as well as its post-colonial adoption and absorption. As in the joke about Inshallah, the thinking would go something like this. Europeans have efficient machines, but ultimately we are left with the Téléphone Arabe. This self-critique merges with an internalized version of the colonial critique. Téléphone Arabe is non-functional or functions poorly. In the Third World, this self-critique seems in part to be inspired by the inferior technology sold and bought on the black market by those who cannot afford the real thing in nations whose economies facilitate trafficking in knockoffs amongst consumers who have no choice but to substitute the short-term satisfaction and frustration of functional, if limited, machines and who do not have the option of technical support. I won't have time today to comment on films showing comic Arab figures failing to master technology in high-tech Paris. I'm going to just refer to two of them that some of you may have seen. One is Alouache's film Salut Cousin, which shows a kind of bumbling Algerian failing to do business by phone in the public phone booth in Paris. And another one very different would be Kassovitz, La Haine, Hate, which shows a North African from the suburbs, from the projects, who is not an Arabic speaker, but who similarly is finding it hard to function in high-tech Paris. He's reduced to kind of low-tech situations, which are extremely comic. In the first film I mentioned, Alouache's Hello Cousin, this missed communication between the metropole and the former colony suggests, in technological and linguistic terms, the time lag of cultural difference between the metropole and the former colony. The situation that Fanon describes in Black Skin, White Masks as a time lag, okay, cultural difference. The cultural and linguistic otherness that endures in spite of technological modernity, the lack of mastery over technology, the inability to use technology to solve problems, strategic, linguistic, etc., all stage what Fanon identifies as the belatedness, in quotes, that's his term, of the colonial subject. Alouache's hilarious scenes also mock the very serious use of the telephone by immigrants as a lifeline and source of support to family across the ocean. And I tried to capture that in this image. This was taken in Montreuil, right outside of Paris, where there's a huge Malian population, people who are living temporarily in France and who will return to Mali. And you really see them en masse on Sunday phoning home from the phone booth. This is a telephone practice that would be well known in Paris to a Paris audience. And although they're not doing it here, it refers to another kind of version of Téléphone Arabe, which I'm now going to try to explain. First of all, the phone has been used, phone technology has been used for signaling, wiring, and confirming receipt of funds, back home to the family back at home. And this is a very serious use of the phone. And along with this, there has been a practice of sharing the broken phone, okay, which is no longer possible. When there were coin-operated phones or jeton-operated phones, you would often see a long line outside of a public phone booth that where you would not ever hang up, but you would pass the line to the next person in line, and basically you could make free calls overseas. The new system of phones operated by telephone cards, or télécartes, such as you see here, has changed the culture of phoning from public phone booths, which are used less by a cell phone-equipped population. Yet these public phones are still frequently used to make the international calls that not all cell phone service permits. Vendors of special cards to be used for calling overseas have become visible in many Paris neighborhoods. As telephone technologies are passing from the metropole to former colonies, third world phoning practices are coming to the metropole. And now I'm shifting over to Morocco. This is an advertisement for phone service that's put out by Maroc Telecom. What does it mean to import or imitate telecommunication systems? For example, the French cellular service called Nomade, conceived for urban pro-structuralist citizens in the metropole. What does it mean to take that and adapt it to a population that includes nomads, both recently and temporarily coming to settlement? Maroc Telecom has adapted the metaphors and poetics of French telephone service to Moroccan culture. The billboards, brochures, advertisements, and marketing events for their campaigns and their competitors' campaigns refer to traditional communication networks, such as musicians' groups, the desert caravan, the nomad tent, as well as using global imagery, Hollywood imagery, American music, etc. Morocco is now trying to sell home phone and internet service under the metaphors of house and home. And I didn't have time to talk about this, but landline phone in Morocco basically skipped a generation. There was not a huge implementation of landlines. And as in many other places in the developing world, people have skipped directly to cell phone. But this is appealing to customers who can think ahead, fill up the gas tank basically for a whole year, pay in one overall fee for all of your services. And they're significantly using the Arabic term el mansil instead of the local Moroccan term dar for house. But the images and the practices in telephone use in Morocco, I would argue, remain focused on mobility, freedom, nomadism, and sharing. Across Morocco, one now sees many veiled as well as unveiled women with cell phones, and here in the teleboutique, suggesting not only the range of phoning practices by each user, public and private, but also the huge range of clients, age, economic situation, and openness of access. The presence of cyber cafes, similarly offering public access to the internet at a relatively low cost, and the ability of customers to share a screen and a session makes it possible, I think, for more people to come in to use the technology. There are often young women in the cyber cafes, even in remote rural locations. Sometimes they're even run by women. I think that it suggests that there is a pretty broad accessibility through these practices of sharing and community. Linked then to these practices, linked to the public sphere, even to nomadism that is not a fixed state, but an option that some citizens return to off and on when rainfall makes it possible, the teleboutique and the cyber cafes remain the hub of a generation's access to technology. In other work, I've mentioned that this particular woman who represents the traditional Sahrawi culture of the South uses the technology to spread her language and her culture, far from being threatened by it, I've argued. She's able to use the technologies to enrich. Let's see. At the same time, against the grain of technology transfer, third world phoning practices are coming to the first world urban settings. Practices of phoning out from the teleboutique are now being adopted in places like Paris, where these storefronts, certain kinds of storefront taxi phone boutiques actually are springing up in neighborhoods like Belleville. Even cell phone owners gravitate to them to take advantage of their cheaper international rates, either by buying a card or by using the phones installed there. Barely 20 years after socialism's first push to modernize France, 10 years after the advent of card-operated public phones and cellular phone service, French populations are adopting a calling practice from the former colonies. In the same way, vendors of special télécartes to be used for calling overseas have become visible in many Paris neighborhoods. A quick look at these suggests how a range of telephoning practices have now been assimilated into the idea of a card. One, and that's the one on the top here, sold in French post offices, tabac, and newsagents, often has French, in quotes, themes or pictures on it. The France Télécom card here, for example, carries the slogan, "Making my phone card in my image," and illustrates this idea of self-fashioning with a picture of a small boy on his tricycle. This particular card also carries a URL for a website where one can download pictures or upload a photo to be printed on the card, and where one can then order a pack of 4, 10, or 100 of these. The additional slogan, "Smile, you're on mycard.com," suggests that the funny surveillance of a candid camera is supplemented by the idea of using the cards for publicity, or is a modern version of the faire part announcement card. There's a phone card for every special event in your life, wedding, birth, anniversary, moving. This is the publicity. But other kinds of cards, and here I'm representing on the bottom, sold by teleboutique or by storefront vendors, giving callers a special bundled rate for overseas calls, exhibit a very different iconography. The card here, called Destination Maghreb, allows about 20 minutes of phone time for €7.50. Rather than slogans, it contains urgent information. Do not insert in a public phone booth, i.e., it's not the France Télécom card with the chip that you see on the top. It contains access numbers to be used from Paris, from a mobile phone, or from other locations in France, or from a phone booth where calls are more expensive and thus the same money would buy a shorter call. This card represents a Tuareg, head bound in indigo, looking off toward a horizon and with a caravan of camels moving across sand dunes in the background. In short, a fantasy of Africans, made perhaps in their image, but not by them. When shown this particular international calling card, a former French telephone industry chief told me, quote, "That is not a France Télécom product." Yet, sure enough, here's the France Télécom version. They follow suit with this other card, significantly called a ticket téléphone, in quotation marks on the card. Not a télécarte. For €7.50, a caller gets a better rate to North Africa, again by calling a free local number and then a code revealed by scratching the card. There's an expiry date and a free number to call for help or information. There's even instructions in English on this card. And most significantly, I think, is the slogan here. There's this magnificent Moorish architecture, and then "Take all the time you want to call the Maghreb." Deploying the stereotype of time or timelessness attached to this magical world, the world of the time lag is not bought, where time is not bought with money. This is really in sharp contrast to the image I showed you earlier. Fill up your tank, for a whole year of tranquility. People who have to work and people who are counting their dimes. Okay. Thus, so-called third world phoning practices with their low technology are moving into the first world with the same rapidity with which first world technological service and products are sold to the developing world. While the taxi phone teleboutiques reproduce third world calling practices, the urban nomad fully armed with a mobile phone can be as efficient as the military man with his walkie-talkie, and gives rise to another image of Téléphone Arabe as one to be feared. The mystery of the Téléphone Arabe now endures in the shape of the fear inspired by an Arabophone armed with a cell phone. In the McGraw-Hill pedagogical film Le Chemin de Retour, used to teach second-year French in institutions like ours, the main character, a young French journalist, you see her here, finds herself exploring family history in Morocco. The film shows some concern for linguistic realism. In one scene, the grocer picks up his cell phone and speaks Arabic to his boss. The scene, however, is unrealistic in other ways, exaggerating the foreignness of the Moroccan who speaks perfect French. and whose boss, in fact, is French, so why would he be speaking Arabic to him? And exaggerating French naivete with regard to Islam in a short but patronizing lecture he gives to the journalist. This textbook considers it important for English-speaking students of French to understand something of the colonial relationship between France and Morocco and the living tradition, if not the contradictions, of francophonie. Yet it continues the mystification of the language and culture in the French literary and artistic imagination, relegating Morocco to a fictionalized past, even in spite of contemporary technology transfer visible in the cell phone. Here, the Arab doing business in Arabic on the cell phone emphasizes the threat that Islam vaguely represents. Yet it is significant that the scene avoids the téléboutique and the grocer uses his cell phone for calling out, something most Moroccan cell phone users cannot afford to do. And I'm going to show you the clip. I'm going to have to skip a clip from La Haine, just very brief. Let's see. Okay, oops. Oh no. Oh no.
Just hold it there.
Salam alaikum, marhaban. Puis-je vous être utile, mademoiselle?
Je voudrais parler à Monsieur Fergus.
C'est malheureusement impossible. Monsieur Fergus est absent.
Mais je suis venue de Paris pour le voir.
Je regrette, il est malade et il a demandé qu'on ne le dérange pas.
Dites-lui que je viens de la part d'un ami, je suis la fille d'Antoine Leclerc.
Inutile d'insister, mademoiselle.
Je vous en prie, c'est très important pour moi.
Allô? J'ai dit Fergus, صباح الخير. حميد، أنت هنا بنت فرنسية تقول إنها حفيدة أنطوان كلير وحابة تتلاقى بيك. نعم، أنطوان لوكلير. واخا سيدي. واخا، دابا نقولها. Monsieur Fergus veut bien vous recevoir chez lui, mais il faudra vous vêtir dignement.
Dignement?
Cheveux cachés sous un foulard, pas de robe courte ni décolletée.
Entendu. Où habite-t-il?
Okay. And now I'm going to move to my concluding section. Exploring the elements encoded in the Téléphone Arabe introduces oral, and linguistic components into debates on the visualized and spatialized relations of colonial subjection in post-colonial theory. While post-colonial theory has often focused on the oppression of peoples based on visible relations of color and class, it is tempting to see the oral realm as relatively freer, a realm of potential resistance to colonial oppression. In Ismail Ferruqui's The Long Trip, for example, the oral bond created by the Arabic text of the Quran across many countries and cultures suggests a powerful response to the reductive colonial gaze described by Fanon, or the photographic fixity of the stereotype described by Homi Bhabha in The Other Question. It is tempting to see disappearing into the oral realm as a third world strategy of self-representation on a different temporal as well as representational scale that might serve as an example of what Bhabha proposes as an alternative to the synchronous and spatial representation of cultural difference, for example, in the work of Frederick Jameson. In Postmodernity, Jameson writes, "The telephone itself has disappeared as furniture, and this change signals a problem of representation posed by the new generation of mobile, nearly invisible technologies. How do we describe the effect technologies have on our thinking when they are invisible in our world, or when they create invisibility?" Jameson adopts the term cognitive mapping, making sense of one's urban surroundings. Jameson is using the concepts of space, representability, and allegory as tools of analysis to get at the fundamental representational problem of what cannot be seen under the surface or under the radar. And here I'm citing Jameson. Sorry, I don't have this on a slide, but I do have Homi Bhabha's response. So Jameson talks about what cannot be seen under the surface or under the radar. Late capitalism, whose mechanisms and dynamics are not visible in that sense, cannot be detected on the surfaces scanned by satellites, and therefore stand as a fundamental representational problem of a historically new and original type. Bhabha responds to this in this passage from Race, Time, and the Revision of Modernity. It is this synchronous and spatial representation of cultural difference that must be reworked as a framework for cultural otherness within the general dialectic of doubling that postmodernism proposes. Otherwise, we are likely to find ourselves beached amidst Jameson's cognitive mappings of the third world, which might work for the Bonaventura Hotel in Los Angeles, but will leave you somewhat eyeless in Gaza. On one hand, we can conceive of telephonic orality as returning to oral traditions and expanding word-of-mouth networks, in some ways freeing its subjects from visual stereotypes of racism and from what Bhabha calls the spatial traditions of some aspects of postmodern theory, allowing expression in a different temporal, even representational mode that addresses the problem of the ambivalent temporality of modernity, the time lag of cultural difference. At the same time, the telephone itself is moving toward visualization, becoming a camera and a computer, sending images with text and voice messages, downloading images and video. While the concept of Téléphone Arabe means the pre-existing networks of communication, the technology simply solidifies via instruments, it is continually visualized and stereotyped in reductive racist terms in what are now global contexts. Fear of a Téléphone Arabe facilitating the kind of postmodern invisibility Jameson defines has been apparent in the last few years in the US rhetoric of the war on terror, in the project of uncovering the enemy in their, quote, hiding places and bringing them into the self-described light of US justice. Even academics in the field of visual cultural studies generalize about the threat of an oral culture seen as anti-visual and iconoclastic. W.J.T. Mitchell, among others, has argued that the destruction of the World Trade Center was a form of Islamic iconoclasm, but fails to clarify the link between destruction of an image and of a building, or between bombings by Islamic extremists and Islam. Beyond the mobility and mastery promised and sometimes produced in limited ways by cell phones, its freedoms are illusory. Disappearing into the telephonic realm is impossible, not because of its policing, but by definition, as the telephone relies upon as well as creates an answering subject, one who recognizes that the call is for him. Since its inception, telephone technology has been far from liberating. Following on the earliest telephone technologies, the cell phone has become a prosthetic device, signaling a variation on the pathology of the telephone theorized by Avital Ronell. Yet the phone's limitations or its ways of limiting us are forgotten as it becomes suspect as an instrument of terror, used to connect the terrorist to his cell or rigged to trigger the remote detonation of bombs in urban areas. The telephone becomes the exaggerated symbol of the terrorist's power over his and our environment, as it becomes the focus of efforts to identify suspects, link members of a cell, trace histories and strategies of attacks. So what is feared is the combination of telephone with Arabe, the network of communications represented by Islam that predates and transcends the technology. Since the September 11th attacks, the threat of the Téléphone Arabe now reigns. No longer a joke, it has become the thing that governments want to listen to. It has dominated US representations of Islamist terror cells and drives the project to bring them to light. While considering the extent to which the fear and fantasy of the Téléphone Arabe, its global reach, its untranslatable codes, its international construction of Islam, are projected in the current policy of telephonic domestic surveillance, it is worth noting that in his Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Louis Althusser describes as telecommunication the call or hailing through which subjects are recruited and submit to subjection, for example, to the state. and I've just pulled this paragraph, very famous essay by Althusser. Ideology recruits subjects among the individuals, it recruits them all, or transforms the individuals into subjects, it transforms them all, by that very precise operation which I have called interpolation or hailing, and which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police or other hailing. Hey, you there. Experience shows that the practical telecommunication of hailings is such that they hardly ever miss their man. Verbal call or whistle, the one hailed always recognizes that it is really him who is being hailed. But the rhetoric of the war on terror casts terrorists as masterminds who in fact escape this call, use technology to become invisible and bend it to their destructive ends. Terrorism experts predicted as early as 1988 that, quote, terrorists are undergoing a dangerous metamorphosis from technological clods relying on fanaticism to skilled tacticians who can change technologies as necessary. The 2006 arrests of members of a British cell revealed that cell phone conversations were avoided. Rather than using email messages, communications were passed through internet chats or by electronic messages stored for others to pick up later with passwords. Computer hard drives and cell phone SIM cards were discarded and replaced often. Seeking to escape identification and interpolation, would-be terrorists reinvent themselves through the strategic use of technologies, facilitating invisibility. Terrorism is defined by the wrong use of technologies, yet terrorists do not have greater control over technology than non-terrorists, nor are they alone in breaking laws governing technology's use. The rhetoric of the war on terror reveals the disproportion between the reality and the representation of the threat, and the response to it that has rocked the foundational notion of privacy in the United States. Efforts to apprehend terrorists have led to the justification of domestic surveillance in the United States, much of it by telephone, a concomitant rise in the study of Arabic in universities and military training centers for investigative rather than educational purposes, the recruiting of Arabic speakers by the US military and intelligence agencies, and a well-known backlog of untranslated conversations. In spite of court challenges, the current administration has continued to justify domestic surveillance as integral to a war on terror. But meanwhile, all of our mobile conversations have been listened to. When we are hailed, we all answer the call.